The Ninth Seam. Chapter 1. The Job Nobody Wanted. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I saw at 7,200 feet below the surface of the Cassidy Basin, in a mine that doesn't officially exist anymore. Working for a company that scrubbed its own name off every document it could find. I'm writing this down because I need someone, anyone, to know what happened to the crew of Kestrel Station before I stop being able to trust my own memory of it. Already the details are softening at the edges, the way a bruise fades, and I'm afraid that if I wait any longer I'll convince myself it was nothing. Fatigue, bad air, a trick of the dark. It wasn't a trick of the dark. I want to be clear about that before I start, because everything I'm about to tell you sounds like exactly the kind of story you'd expect from a man who spent 4 months living under a mountain with 11 other people and started seeing things. I've turned that thought over so many times now, testing it, hoping it would fit better than the truth. It doesn't fit. The truth is heavier, and it doesn't care whether I want to carry it. Kestrel Station was a deep access exploratory rig, part of a joint venture between a mineral extraction firm and a research consortium nobody in the crew ever got a straight answer about. Officially, we were core sampling for rare earth deposits in a stratum nobody had drilled before. A seam of rock the geologists kept calling anomalous, in a tone that made the word sound like a warning rather than a description. Unofficially, half of us suspected we were digging for something else entirely, and the other half didn't care as long as the paycheck cleared, because the paycheck was enormous. 4 months underground, minimal contact with the surface, a bonus structure that made most of us feel like we'd won a strange, grim lottery. I took the job because my daughter needed a surgery my insurance wouldn't touch, and because I am, by nature, the kind of person who doesn't ask enough questions when the money is good. There were 12 of us on the roster. I'll give you names, because the names matter, because somebody besides me should remember them before the company's paperwork finishes erasing them. Renner ran the drill floor, a broad, quiet man who talked to the machines more than he talked to us, and who I never once saw lose his temper, not even in the last week, when losing his temper would have been the only sane response. Ibarra was our geologist, sharp and funny and utterly convinced that whatever we were pulling out of the Ninth Seam was going to make her career. Voss handled comms and life support, a wiry ex-Navy technician who checked the CO2 scrubbers so obsessively that we used to joke he loved them more than his ex-wife. Then there was Petrov, and Dunmore, and the Okafor brothers, and Sable, and Vasquez, and Lindquist, and a site supervisor named Marsh who none of us liked, and all of us trusted, which is its own kind of strange combination. And there was Casey Doyle, 26 years old, on his first deep rotation, still young enough to think the dark underground was an adventure instead of a debt you pay back slowly, in pieces, whether you make it out or not. We went down in the second week of September. The elevator cage took 11 minutes to reach the primary staging level at 4,000 feet, and from there a network of access tunnels, some cut decades ago by an older operation, and some freshly bored by our own machines, spidered down another 3,000 feet to the working face. Kestrel Station itself was a modular habitat bolted into a natural cavern the surveys had flagged as unusually stable, a honeycomb of sleeping berths, a mess hall the size of a shipping container, a med bay, and the command module where Marsh and Voss spent most of their waking hours staring at readouts. It smelled like machine oil and recycled air, and underneath that, something mineral and cold that never quite went away, no matter how many times the scrubbers cycled it. The first 3 weeks were exactly what you'd expect from a deep mining operation. Long shifts, aching joints, the particular exhaustion that comes from working somewhere the sun has never touched, where your body starts to forget what day and night are supposed to feel like. We drilled, we cored, we sent samples up the shaft on the cargo lift, and Ibarra got more and more excited about what she called structural irregularities in the Ninth Seam, A layer of rock at the very bottom of our permitted depth that behaved, according to her instruments, nothing like it should. It's not that the rock is unusual, she told me one night in the mess hall, turning a sample over in her gloved hands like it was something alive. It's that it's arranged. Sedimentary layers should be chaotic at this scale, full of noise. This isn't noise. There's a pattern in it, almost like rings, almost like something grew here instead of settling here. I remember laughing at that, the easy laugh of a man who still believed the worst thing waiting for him underground was a payroll dispute. I told her rock doesn't grow. She smiled the way people smile when they know something you don't, and said, everything grows, given enough time. Some things just grow slower than we're built to notice. I think about that conversation more than almost any other memory from Kestrel Station. I think about the particular quality of her smile, which wasn't fear yet, just fascination. The fascination of a scientist standing at the edge of a discovery she hadn't yet understood was a mistake. Chapter 2. The Sounds in the Rock. The first sign that something was wrong came in week 4, and it came, as these things always do, as something almost too small to mention. Voss picked it up first, because listening was his job. He came into the mess hall during a night shift changeover looking the way a man looks when he's checked a number 3 times because he doesn't trust the first 2 results. There's a sound in the 9th scene, he said. Low frequency, comes and goes. I thought it was the drill rig at first, some kind of harmonic feedback through the rock. But the drill's been offline for 6 hours and it's still there. Marsh, our supervisor, didn't like uncertainty, and he liked it even less when it came from Voss, who wasn't prone to false alarms. He had the whole crew gather in the command module and pulled up the audio. It was subtle, a deep, arrhythmic pulse buried so far under the ambient hum of the habitat's own machinery that most of us needed headphones and complete silence to hear it at all. It didn't sound like machinery. It didn't sound like settling rock either, the kind of pop and groan you get used to hearing this deep underground as the pressure works itself out. It had a texture to it, if that makes sense. A kind of wetness, like it was moving through something soft rather than through stone. Could be an aquifer, Ibarra offered, though she didn't sound convinced. Water moving through a cavity would explain the irregularity. There's no aquifer on the survey, Voss said. Surveys are wrong all the time. Not this wrong. Marsh made the call that ended up defining the rest of the expedition, though none of us understood it at the time. He decided we'd continue operations as scheduled, log the anomaly, and flag it in the weekly report to the surface team. In hindsight, I don't blame him. We were 4 weeks into a 4-month contract, deep enough underground that turning back meant forfeiting most of our bonus, and the sound, whatever it was, wasn't doing anything. It was just there, a rhythm under the world, easy to explain away as long as you didn't let yourself listen too closely. Over the next several days, the sound didn't get louder, exactly, but it got more frequent, and something about it started to feel less like background noise and more like breathing. I noticed the crew changing around it, in small ways nobody commented on directly. People started sleeping with music playing, something they hadn't bothered with before. Conversations in the mess hall got a little quieter, a little more clipped, as if everyone had unconsciously decided not to compete with whatever was under the floor. Casey Doyle, the youngest of us, started asking Renner technical questions about the drill's vibration patterns with a kind of forced casualness that fooled nobody. It was Dunmore, one of the drill technicians, who first said out loud what half of us had already started to think, and none of us wanted to say. We were in the equipment bay doing routine maintenance, and he stopped what he was doing, listened for a long moment, and said, "You ever notice it sounds like it's coming from more than one direction?" I told him that was impossible. That sound in solid rock travels along fault lines and layer boundaries, that it would naturally seem to come from odd angles because it wasn't traveling in a straight line. This was true, and also completely beside the point, because what Dunmore meant wasn't about physics. He meant that it sounded, to him, like there was more than one source, like something was answering something else. I told him he needed more sleep. He agreed, a little too readily, and neither of us worked in that equipment bay alone again without finding an excuse to bring someone else along. Chapter 3. What Petrov found. Petrov was the one who found the tunnel. He was running a routine survey along the eastern edge of the ninth seam, mapping the extent of the anomalous rock layer Ibarra had flagged, when his ground-penetrating equipment returned a result that didn't make sense according to every geological model we'd been given for the site. A void. Not a natural cavity, not a fault line, but a straight, regular passage running perpendicular to the seam, extending beyond the range of his equipment in both directions. Straight lines don't occur naturally at that depth. Straight lines mean somebody, or something, made them. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it's the point where I think we made our first real mistake. The mistake that everything afterward grew out of like rot, grows out of a single soft spot in an apple. We should have called the surface. We should have shut down operations and waited for a decision from people whose job it was to weigh risk against reward from a position of safety 4,000 feet above us, with the option of simply not going down again. Instead, Marsh authorized a small excavation team, led by Petrov and including Ibarra, Renner, and myself, to open a controlled breach into the passage and document what was on the other side before reporting anything to the surface. I've asked myself many times why he made that call, and I think the honest answer is the same reason any of us did anything down there. Curiosity is a kind of gravity, and once you're close enough to a mystery, it pulls harder than caution does. It took us 2 days to cut through into the passage safely. When we finally broke through, the space on the other side took the breath out of all 4 of us at once, and not because of what was in it, but because of what it was. A tunnel, roughly 7 feet in height, walls smooth in a way natural stone never is, curving gently along its length like the inside of something that had been hollowed rather than dug. There were no tool marks. There was no rubble, no debris, no sign of excavation at all, as if the rock had simply chosen, at some point in a past too distant to calculate, to not be there anymore. Ibarra's flashlight beam followed the curve of the tunnel wall and caught on markings, faint ridges in the stone in a repeating pattern, not quite geometric, not quite organic, the kind of shape your eye wants to resolve into something familiar and never quite manages to. She reached out to touch one, and Renner grabbed her wrist before she made contact, which surprised all of us, because Renner never touched anyone if he could avoid it. "Don't," he said. That was all. He didn't explain why, and none of us asked him to, because in that moment none of us wanted an answer that would make the fear in the room any more specific than it already was. We documented the tunnel with cameras and sensors for 6 hours, going no further than about 40 meters in either direction, and then we sealed the breach and returned to the habitat to compile our report. That night, for the first time since the sounds began, the low pulse in the rock stopped completely. None of us slept well. The silence was worse than the noise had been. Chapter 4. Casey. I need to talk about Casey Doyle now, because what happened to him is the reason I can't let this story stay buried the way the company wants it to stay buried. Casey was 26, from a small town in the interior. The kind of kid who'd grown up idolizing his uncle's stories about working the deep rigs and had finally gotten his own shot at it. He was eager in a way that made the older crew members simultaneously fond of him and a little protective. The way you get with someone who reminds you of who you used to be before the work wore the eagerness down to something more careful. He and I had bunks near each other, and some nights, when neither of us could sleep, we'd talk quietly about nothing in particular. His girlfriend back home, my daughter, the absurd amount of money we were both going to have when the contract ended. 3 days after we sealed the breach into the passage, Casey started sleepwalking. The first time, Sable found him standing in the equipment bay at 4 in the morning, facing the wall that separated the habitat from the excavation site. Not moving, not responding when she said his name. It took her almost a full minute of increasingly urgent attempts before he blinked and came back to himself, disoriented, with no memory of leaving his bunk. Voss logged it as a stress response, which was reasonable, given everything, and Marsh had the medtech run a full evaluation that came back clean. No fever, no neurological symptoms, no explanation. It happened again 2 nights later, and this time, I was the one who found him. He was standing in the same spot, facing the same wall, and his lips were moving, very slightly, in a rhythm that took me a horrible, dislocating moment to place. It matched the pulse we'd heard in the rock. Not similar to it, not reminiscent of it. Exactly it, syllable for syllable, if you can call something with no discernible language syllables at all. I said his name. He didn't respond the way he had for Sable. Instead, his head turned toward me, slow, mechanical, and his eyes were open, and they were his eyes, brown, a little bloodshot from bad sleep, entirely ordinary, and that was somehow so much worse than if they hadn't been. A face I knew, doing something no face should do, looking at me with an attention that didn't feel like it was coming from Casey at all. "It's counting," he said. His voice was flat, unhurried, nothing like his usual quick, nervous cadence. "It's been counting for a long time. It wants to know how many of us there are." Then he blinked and staggered, and it was Casey again, scared and confused, and asking me why he was standing in the equipment bay in his socks. I didn't tell him what he'd said. I told Marsh, privately, and Marsh made the decision to schedule Casey for evacuation on the next supply lift, a decision that everyone agreed with and that came 4 days too late. Chapter 5. The Second Passage. Ibarra found the second passage while reviewing the ground-penetrating data from Petrov's original survey, a section she'd initially dismissed as sensor noise. It ran perpendicular to the first, deeper, wider, extending in a direction that put it almost directly beneath the habitat itself. She brought this to Marsh with the kind of controlled urgency that scientists use when they're trying very hard not to sound like they're panicking. "I don't think this is a single tunnel system," she said. "I think it's a network, and I think it's old. Older than anything we have context for. The mineral deposition patterns along the walls of the first passage suggest it's been open, in an atmospheric sense, for an extremely long time, which shouldn't be possible unless something has been actively maintaining it." Marsh asked the question all of us were thinking and none of us wanted to ask out loud. Maintaining it for what? Ibarra didn't have an answer. Nobody did. But the sounds had stopped. Casey's sleepwalking, after that first incident, had settled into something closer to normal, and the company, when Marsh finally sent an update to the surface, expressed what I can only describe as inappropriate enthusiasm. They wanted more data. They wanted samples from inside the tunnel system, not just from its threshold. They wanted, specifically, samples from as deep into the network as we could safely travel, and they were willing to adjust our bonus structure substantially to get them. I want to tell you that we refused. I want to tell you that somebody, anybody, stood up in that command module and said, "This is insane. We are 12 people, 7,000 feet underground, and we have found something that should not exist, and the correct response is to leave, not to go deeper." Nobody said that. We'd already spent 5 weeks convincing ourselves that fear was just an adjustment period, that curiosity was safer than it felt, that the money was worth whatever discomfort came with it. By the time the real danger arrived, we'd already trained ourselves not to trust our own instincts, which I now believe was never an accident. I believe something in that rock had been shaping our decisions long before we understood we were being shaped, nudging us deeper the way water finds the lowest point in a landscape, patient, indirect, and utterly certain of where it wanted us to end up. We began preparing for a deeper excursion, Petrov, Renner, Vasquez, and I were selected for the team, along with Ibarra as lead scientist. Casey's evacuation was scheduled for the same week the excursion was planned. And in another life, a life where the supply lift had come one day earlier, he would have been safely on the surface before any of what happened next began. Instead, he was still with us on the night before our descent, sitting in the mess hall, quieter than usual, staring at nothing. "I keep hearing it in my head even when it's quiet outside," he told me. "Not words, just attention, like it noticed me and now it can't stop noticing me." I told him he'd feel better once he was back on the surface. I believed that when I said it. I have never been more wrong about anything in my life. Chapter 6. Into the Network. We entered the tunnel system on what would have been, by surface reckoning, a Tuesday morning, though down there the concept of morning had long since lost its meaning. 5 of us, full excursion gear, redundant lighting, comms tethered back to the habitat through a relay system Voss had rigged specifically for the expedition. Marsh stayed behind to coordinate, and Casey, against his own preference and Marsh's direct order, was left on light duty at the habitat, one final rotation before his evacuation. The tunnel curved downward at a shallow, consistent grade, and the smoothness of the walls that had unsettled us at the threshold became almost hypnotic the deeper we went. An unbroken, seamless surface that our light slid across without catching on a single irregularity. Ibarra took samples every 50 meters, the same strange rings and ridges recurring in the rock at intervals that felt, though none of us said it aloud, deliberate. Renner walked point, quiet as always, and I noticed him touching the wall of the tunnel occasionally, not the marked sections, just the smooth stone between them, his palm flat against it for a second or two before he kept moving, as if he were checking something only he could feel. About 2 kilometers in, the tunnel opened into a chamber that none of our surveys had predicted, a space large enough that our lights couldn't find the far wall, the ceiling lost somewhere above the reach of our beams. Ibarra's instruments went briefly haywire as we crossed the threshold, magnetic readings spiking and dropping in a pattern she later described as like walking past something enormous that was slowly turning to look at you. Though at the time, none of us said anything that dramatic. We just stood at the edge of the chamber, in the sudden vastness of it, and felt very small in a way that had nothing to do with the physical scale of the space. That was where we found the structures. I don't have a better word for them than structures, though the word implies a kind of intentional architecture that I'm still not sure applies. They rose from the chamber floor in irregular clusters, pale, faintly luminescent formations that Ibarra initially classified as some exotic mineral deposit, tall as a person in places, twisting upward in shapes that avoided any comparison my mind wanted to reach for. They weren't stalagmites. They didn't grow the way mineral formations grow, in patient, layered accretion. They looked, and I recognize how this sounds, grown the way bone grows, or coral, something with an internal logic that had nothing to do with geology. Petrov's equipment detected a faint, consistent warmth radiating from the largest cluster, several degrees above the ambient temperature of the surrounding rock. And Vasquez, who rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying, said quietly that it reminded him of a beehive he'd once found in an abandoned barn, the way the warmth had bled through the walls, even from a distance. Ibarra wanted to take a sample from the largest formation. Renner, again, told her not to touch it, and this time she pushed back, reminding him, not unkindly, that sampling was literally the purpose of the excursion, that the company was paying an enormous amount of money for exactly this kind of data. He looked at her for a long moment and said something I've never forgotten. "I don't think this belongs to the company. I don't think it belongs to anybody. And I don't think we should act like taking a piece of it is a small thing." She took the sample anyway. I don't blame her for it. Not really. We were all operating under the same institutional pressure. The same sense that turning back empty-handed after everything we'd already risked would be its own kind of failure. She used a laser core to extract a small section from the base of the smallest formation, a procedure that should have been entirely unremarkable. The formation didn't bleed, exactly, but it wept. A thin, clear fluid welling up from the incision and running down its pale surface, and every light in the chamber, all 5 of our headlamps simultaneously, flickered at once, the way lights flicker in a building when something enormous elsewhere in the electrical system draws all the available power at the same instant. In the sudden near darkness, before our lights recovered, I heard the pulse again, not from the rock this time, from all around us, close, immediate, and for the first time recognizably rhythmic, in a way that made my whole body go cold before my mind had finished processing why. It sounded like counting. Chapter 7. The Return. We didn't run, though every instinct in my body wanted to. Panic, that deep underground, that far from any exit, is its own kind of death sentence. And some deeply trained part of all of us understood that even in the worst moment of our lives, we moved quickly, deliberately, back toward the tunnel entrance, Ibarra clutching her sample case like it was both the most valuable and most dangerous thing she'd ever held, which in retrospect it probably was. The trip back felt longer than the trip in, though the distance was identical. Twice, Vasquez stopped and insisted he'd heard footsteps behind us on the smooth stone floor, a sound with no echo pattern that matched 5 people in excursion gear. Twice, we stopped, listened, heard nothing, and kept moving, faster each time. It was Petrov who noticed, about halfway back, that the markings on the tunnel walls had changed, not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been obvious if we hadn't already spent hours studying them on the way in. But the pattern of ridges and rings, the ones Ibarra had cataloged so carefully, were subtly different, as though something had traced back over our path after we passed, and left an updated version of whatever message the marks were meant to convey. None of us said what we were all thinking, which was that whatever lived in that chamber, whatever those formations were connected to, was aware of us in a way that went beyond simple detection. It was responding. It was adjusting. It was, in some sense, none of us had the vocabulary to describe learning. We reached the habitat 6 hours after we'd left it, exhausted, badly shaken, and desperate for the ordinary, mundane comfort of the mess hall's fluorescent lights and Voss's terrible coffee. Marsh met us at the airlock, and one look at our faces told him this hadn't gone the way the mission brief had promised. But it was what he told us next that turned a bad day into the beginning of the end. "Casey's missing," he said. "Since about 4 hours ago. We've searched every module in the habitat. He's not here." Chapter 8. The Search. We searched for 11 hours straight, in rotating pairs, covering every accessible corridor and chamber within the habitat's footprint and the immediate excavation zone around it. Voss ran the comms relay continuously, calling Casey's name into every open channel, and the silence that answered him got heavier with every hour that passed. There was no sign of forced entry anywhere, no equipment missing except a single handheld light and a length of guide rope from the excursion locker. No indication of where he might have gone or why, except for one detail that none of us wanted to say out loud until Lindquist finally forced the issue during a search briefing. The only unsecured access point anywhere in the habitat's perimeter was the sealed breach into the first tunnel passage, the one we'd cut through weeks earlier. Its lock mechanism showed no signs of tampering. It had simply been opened, properly, by someone who knew the access code, and resealed behind them. Only 6 people had that code. All 6 of us were accounted for. I don't think I need to explain what that meant to any of us in that room, but I'll say it anyway, because saying it is the only way I know how to make it real for you the way it became real for us. Something had gotten Casey's code out of him. Not by force, because there was no evidence of force, no struggle. Nothing but an orderly, deliberate departure through a door that should have been impossible for anyone else to open. We found him 9 hours into the search, 40 meters into the first passage, sitting cross-legged against the tunnel wall with his headlamp switched off, guide rope still coiled neatly beside him, unused. He was alive. I want to say that clearly, because for one terrible moment, when Renner's light found him slumped against the stone, we were all certain we were looking at a body. He was breathing, slow and even, eyes closed. And when Sable knelt beside him and said his name, he opened his eyes immediately, as if he'd simply been waiting for someone to ask. "It let me go," he said, before anyone asked him anything at all. "It wanted me to tell you that. It let me go because it's not finished counting yet, and it needs all of you to stay a little longer for the count to mean anything." We got him back to the medbay. Physically, he was fine. Dehydrated, mildly hypothermic from the ambient temperature of the tunnel. Nothing that a day of rest and fluids couldn't address. But something in his eyes had changed. A kind of stillness that hadn't been there before. The stillness of someone who has stopped being afraid of a thing, not because the thing has become less frightening, but because they've come to some other, quieter understanding of it, that the rest of us didn't share, and that he didn't seem inclined to explain further. Marsh made the call, finally, the call that should have been made weeks earlier. He contacted the surface and requested immediate evacuation of the entire crew, citing unspecified safety concerns. It should have ended there. It should have been the beginning of the story where we all got to go home. The company's response came back within the hour, and it was not what any of us expected. Evacuation denied, pending review. A senior representative would be arriving via the next scheduled lift in approximately 36 hours to assess the situation directly. Until then, standard operations were to continue. Chapter 9. 36 hours. I've thought a great deal about why the company refused to pull us out, and I don't believe it was simple greed, though greed was certainly part of it. I believe, based on things I learned much later, and things I've pieced together since, that the research consortium behind Kestrel Station knew, or at least strongly suspected, what we might find in that seam of rock, and that our discovery, far from being a surprise to them, was closer to a confirmation of something they'd been hunting for a very long time. I believe Casey's disappearance and return, rather than alarming them, made us more valuable, not less. Evidence that whatever was down there could interact directly with a human mind and choose, for reasons of its own, to send that mind back largely intact. I don't know what they were hoping to learn from us in those 36 hours. I know that we spent them in a state that I can only describe as controlled dread. The entire crew clustered together in the mess hall for most of it, taking turns sleeping in shifts, nobody willing to be alone anywhere in the habitat. The low pulse from the rock returning steadily, unmistakably, growing very slightly louder with each passing hour, as though it too understood a schedule was in motion and had decided to keep pace with it. Casey didn't rejoin the group. He stayed in the medbay, calm, coherent, answering questions when the medtech asked them, but with a growing detachment that none of us knew how to interpret. At one point, I sat with him for almost an hour, mostly in silence, and near the end of that hour he said something that I've turned over so many times since that I could recite the exact rhythm of his voice as he said it. "It's not evil," he said. "I want you to understand that, because I think it matters. It's not cruel the way a person is cruel. It's just old, and it's very patient, and it's been alone for longer than any of us can really imagine, and it wants to understand what we are before it decides what we're for. I don't think it hates us. I don't think it loves us either. I think it's the way the ocean is towards something that falls into it. It's not personal. That doesn't make it safe." I asked him what he thought it wanted from us now. "An accurate count," he said. "It already knows how many of us there are. I think now it wants to know if that number is going to change, and how, and why. I think that's what it's been listening for this whole time, Not us talking. It's listening for the pattern of when we stop. I didn't sleep after that conversation. I don't think any of us really slept through those 36 hours. Not properly. And by the time the lift finally arrived carrying the company representative, a composed, unreadable man who introduced himself only as Director Holt, all of us were operating on the kind of exhausted, wired alertness that makes everything feel simultaneously slowed down and sharpened at the edges. Holt toured the excavation site with an expression that I can only describe as professional satisfaction. The look of a man confirming a hypothesis rather than encountering a shock. He asked detailed, specific questions about the formations in the chamber, questions that revealed he already knew far more about the geology and its irregularities than our official briefing had ever suggested. When Ibarra pressed him about what exactly the company had expected to find at this depth, he gave her an answer that none of us have ever been able to fully make sense of. "We didn't expect to find it," he said. "We expected to wake it up." Chapter 10. What happened to the rest of them? I'm not going to be able to give you a clean account of what happened over the next several hours, and I think it's important that you understand why, rather than assuming I'm withholding details out of some misplaced sense of drama. What happened quickly, in overlapping fragments, in a habitat where the lights failed intermittently, and the comms relay dropped in and out, and people were moving in different directions at once. And I have spent every day since trying to assemble those fragments into a sequence that makes sense, and I have never fully succeeded. Holt ordered a second excursion into the chamber, immediately, over Marsh's strenuous objection, citing authorization from a level of the company none of us had any ability to verify or refuse. He wanted a larger sample from the central formation, the one Renner had specifically warned Ibarra away from during our first visit. Petrov, Renner, Vasquez, Holt himself, and Holt's own security escort, a silent, heavily equipped man named Argyle who none of us had seen before that day, made up the second team. I was ordered to remain at the habitat to assist Voss with the comms relay, which is, I believe now, the only reason I am alive to write any of this down. The team reached the chamber in just under 2 hours, according to the comms log Voss maintained throughout. For the first 40 minutes, everything proceeded according to plan. Status updates coming through clearly, Holt's clipped, satisfied voice, describing the formations in clinical detail for a recording he was apparently making for people above even his own position. Then the relay began cutting out, brief gaps at first, a few seconds of static swallowing whole sentences, and Voss's expression, as he worked to stabilize the signal, went from professional focus to something closer to open fear, faster than I'd ever seen in him. The last coherent transmission we received was Renner's voice, not Holt's, low and urgent, in a way that violated every instinct of calm I'd come to associate with him. "It's not one," he said. "We had it wrong. It's not one thing in here. It's..." And then the transmission dissolved into a burst of noise that Voss later described, in the incident report he was eventually forced to file, as not consistent with any known interference pattern, which is a very careful, very technical way of saying that none of us who heard it that night have ever been able to explain what it actually was. It sounded, if I'm honest, less like noise and more like several voices trying to speak through the same channel at once, overlapping, none of them fully forming words, all of them urgent in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up before my conscious mind had finished registering the sound at all. The relay never reconnected. Voss and I waited 2 hours, running every diagnostic he had, before Marsh made the decision to send a third team in after them. Myself, Lindquist, and Sable, over the strong, frightened objection of nearly everyone left in the habitat, because someone had to go, and there was no version of that night where staying and doing nothing felt like a real option. We found the chamber exactly as we'd left it days before, vast, pale, faintly luminescent, except for one difference that none of us were prepared for despite every warning we'd already received. The formations had grown, not subtly, not in a way that could be explained by any time frame we understood. Structures that had stood roughly at head height on our first visit now rose well past the reach of our lights, and the warmth Petrov's equipment had detected before was now strong enough to feel directly through our excursion suits, a slow, organic heat that had nothing in common with geothermal activity. We found Argyle first, or what our lights allowed us to identify as Argyle, near the chamber's edge, and I am choosing, deliberately, not to describe what we found in detail, because I don't think doing so would serve any purpose except cruelty to you and to the memory of a man none of us even really knew. I will say only that he had not survived whatever had happened in that chamber, and that the manner of it made clear, immediately, that we were not dealing with a rock fall or an equipment failure, or any of the mundane explanations we'd been quietly hoping for on the walk in. We did not find Holt. We did not find Petrov, or Vasquez, or Renner. What we found, near the base of the central formation, was Renner's headlamp, still lit, its beam angled upward into the vast dark of the chamber's ceiling, resting on the stone floor as though it had been set down deliberately, carefully, by someone who wanted whoever came looking to have at least that much light to see by. Chapter 11. The Evacuation. I'm not going to pretend that what followed was heroic, or even coherent. Lindquist, Sable, and I retreated from that chamber faster than any of us have ever moved in our lives. And I don't remember large parts of the return trip, only fragments. The sound of my own breathing inside my suit, Sable's hand gripping my arm hard enough to bruise at a moment when the tunnel wall beside us seemed, for just an instant, to ripple, the particular quality of relief, when the habitat's lights finally came into view ahead of us, dimmer than usual, flickering, but real, ours, human-made. Marsh didn't ask questions when we returned. One look at our faces was enough. He initiated a full emergency evacuation protocol, contacting the surface directly, bypassing any pretense of waiting for company authorization. And for the first time since Kestrel Station had gone operational, the surface responded immediately and without argument. I think, in hindsight, that whatever Holt had been reporting up the chain before the relay failed had been enough to convince even the people above him that something had gone catastrophically wrong, and that argument was no longer the priority. The lift to the surface staging level could carry 6 people at a time. There were 7 of us left: myself, Marsh, Voss, Sable, Lindquist, the remaining Okafor brother, and Casey, still moving with that unsettling, detached calm that had settled over him since his return from the first passage. Calm that felt, by that point, less like shock and more like a man who had already made peace with something the rest of us hadn't been told about yet. We drew straws, absurdly, for who would take the first lift and who would wait for the second run, an act of ordinary, human decision-making that felt almost obscene given everything happening around us. And yet, it was also the last completely normal thing that happened during the entire expedition. And I've held on to that memory harder than almost any other, because everything after it stopped being normal in any sense at all. Casey didn't draw a straw. He simply said, quietly, that he'd wait for the second lift, and something in his tone made it clear this wasn't an offer open to negotiation. Marsh, exhausted past the point of arguing, agreed. The first lift took myself, Voss, Sable, and the Okafor brother up toward the staging level, an 11-minute ascent that felt, in the moment, like the longest 11 minutes of my life, all of us silent, none of us willing to say aloud what we were all thinking, which was that 11 minutes was a very long time to leave 2 people alone with whatever was still down there. The lift reached the staging level. We climbed out into air that felt, for the first time in months, genuinely different, thinner somehow, or perhaps that was only relief. Voss immediately began working to bring the lift back down for the second group, and we waited, all of us gathered at the shaft head, watching the indicator lights track its slow descent. It reached the bottom. It stayed there for 4 minutes, which the operational log records precisely, though none of us needed a log to feel every second of it. Then it began its ascent, and every one of us held our breath in a way that felt, looking back, like some kind of prayer none of us had the language for. Chapter 12. What Came Up. The lift arrived at the staging level carrying exactly 2 people. And for one suspended, disbelieving moment, relief flooded through all of us so completely that none of us immediately registered what was wrong with the scene in front of us. Marsh stood at the front of the cage, pale, shaking, alive. Casey stood beside him, upright, apparently unharmed, and it took several seconds, several full seconds of my mind refusing to process what my eyes were reporting before I understood what had changed. Casey's eyes were open, fixed forward, and he was not blinking. He had not blinked, as far as any of us could tell, since the lift doors had opened. His chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm that I recognized, with a horror that dropped through me like a physical weight, as the exact same rhythm as the pulse we'd first heard in the rock, all those weeks ago, before any of this began. Marsh stumbled out of the cage and grabbed Voss by the shoulders, his voice cracking in a way I had never once heard from him in 4 months underground. "It's not him," he said. "Something happened on the way up. Something happened, and it's not him anymore, and I don't know what to do. And I didn't know what else to do but bring him with me, because I couldn't leave him down there. I couldn't. But it's not him. It's not him." I want to tell you what happened after that, how the surface team responded, what the medical evaluation found, what the company ultimately did with the information, and I find that I can't. Not because I don't remember, but because within 6 hours of our surfacing, every one of us who had come up from Kestrel Station was separated, individually, into isolated evaluation, and the last clear memory I have of that facility is being escorted down a corridor by 2 people in unmarked protective gear who would not answer any of my questions, past a reinforced door with a small observation window, through which, for just a moment, I saw Casey sitting alone in a bare white room, hands folded in his lap, that same slow, patient rhythm still visible in the rise and fall of his chest, and his eyes, when they turned toward the window and found mine through the glass, were not afraid, were not confused, were simply, calmly, attentively counting. Epilogue. I don't know what happened to the others left underground. I've asked, through every channel available to me, and I have received only silence, non-disclosure paperwork, and, eventually, a settlement offer large enough to comfortably pay for my daughter's surgery twice over, contingent on my signature and my silence. I took the money. I'm not proud of that, but I'd be lying if I pretended I regretted it enough to give it back. What I couldn't give up was the need to tell somebody, anybody, what actually happened down there, even if it costs me everything the settlement was meant to protect. I don't know if Kestrel Station is still operational. I don't know if there's another crew down there right now, hearing that same slow pulse in the rock, telling themselves it's just settling stone, just an aquifer, just bad air, and worse sleep. I don't know if Casey is still in that white room, still counting, or if whatever counted through him eventually got the number it was looking for and moved on to something else. What I know is this: something ancient lives beneath the Cassidy Basin, patient beyond any human measure of patience, and it has been listening for a very long time, waiting to understand what we are and what we're for. It is not cruel in any way I recognize as cruelty. It simply has its own arithmetic, and I believe, though I can't prove it, and God knows I hope I'm wrong, that the equation isn't finished yet, that somewhere far beneath our feet, in the dark, in the old rock, something is still counting and still waiting, with the terrible, unbothered patience of something that has never once needed to hurry, for the number to change again. If you ever hear about a new deep access mining operation opening in a basin with a name that sounds a little too carefully chosen to sound ordinary, I'd ask you to remember this account. Ask questions. Ask who's really funding it and why, and what they expect to find at the bottom of a seam of rock that behaves like something grew it, instead of something that's settled there over the ordinary. Patient span of geological time. And if you're ever offered a very well-paying job that requires 4 months underground and very few questions, I would ask you, as someone who has already made that mistake once, to think very carefully about how much you trust the people asking you to go, and how much you trust your own certainty that whatever's down there is simply rock and darkness and nothing more. Because some things that sleep beneath the earth were never actually asleep at all. They were only ever waiting. And I am no longer certain that any of us who went down into the ninth seam ever really came all the way back up. End?